That just wasn't possible in communist Poland. So I grew up very cognizant of the achievement that a market society is. It has to be built and protected by the people who inherit it. I just remember looking at my syllabus of readings of my doctoral program, and I was like, this isn't just like a little bit of Marxism. This is like Marxist political economy. Universities trying to do too many things and being too many things to too many people that have muddied their mission, and as a result they do everything in a mediocre way but nothing in a great way. What kinds of people are being nurtured and created by the university system? Are these people capable of living up to the mission of the university? The Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is the first stage of the creation of a sovereign wealth fund in the United States.
Can Western academia be fixed from within, or do we need to found new universities? What is the outlook for Europe, a continent in decline? Where can we find the Marxism underpinning the bestseller Debt, the First 5,000 Years, a book on the anthropology of money that has been cited over 10,000 times in scientific literature? These are some of the questions I get to tackle with the brilliant anthropologist and historian Natalie Smolenski, founder of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation. Now, before we go into the episode, I have to admit, we unfortunately lost the footage of one camera angle. Luckily, it was the one that was pointed at me. But yeah, we fixed it as best we could, and I don't think it takes away from Natalie's awesome ideas on display. Natalie, so good to have you.
Yes, great to be here.
Yeah. Well, you are an anthropologist, and I want to ask you about that. Kind of what, because it's rare. It's rare to talk to an anthropologist. I don't know many at all. Actually, when I studied African studies in Ghent, we were on the same floor as the anthropologists. And it was a basement with like all the tubes and everything, and probably like the dirty water in the tubes and everything. But yeah, so I'm curious, how did you get into anthropology, and then also what's like your impression of the field? And like, first of all, what is anthropology?
Yeah, so all fantastic questions, and I would suggest that what is anthropology is actually being centrally debated right now by the field. So particularly within sociocultural anthropology, which is my subfield specialization, that question is very much up in the air. So anthropology has four fields. There's paleoanthropology, which is basically the study of human evolution through fossil remains. There's archaeology, which kind of brings us into the more recent prehistoric and historic period. And there's linguistic anthropology, which is the study of language, and specifically language change over time. And then the fourth field is cultural anthropology or social anthropology. And that is a huge question. What is that exactly? So,
but yeah. Very simply put, is it like the study of man across time? Because like, what's the difference with history then?
Right. So anthropology focuses on the study of humankind in community. So I would suggest that it's the study of man's day-to-day life. So the elements that history might not write about because they're kind of the day-to-day taken for granted things, cultural norms, rituals, rites of passage, habits, ways that conflict is negotiated, maybe religious beliefs or traditions. Some of these things become historical, of course, but the study of history has tended to focus on events and narrative chronologies of events. That said, these disciplines are very much in flux. There are a lot of historians of everyday life. Some of them would even call themselves historical anthropologists or anthropological historians. In fact, I did doctoral work at a program in anthropology and history precisely for this reason, because the differences can become hard to tease apart.
And so, when you think about anthropology, is it kind of the idea that, okay, if time machines existed, we could go back and experience these communities for ourselves, but we don't have them. So let's do our best to really try and understand what it was like to live in that, rather than just, there was a king and there was a big battle, and that's not the same as being transported. Do you feel like that is getting to the heart of anthropology?
Yeah. So the primary method of the anthropologist is something called ethnography, which is a form of participant observation where the anthropologist submerges himself in the community that they're studying, which doesn't mean going native, actually. That can be a problem because you're there precisely as an outsider with an outsider's perspective to observe a society in ways that they perhaps could not observe themselves. And so the anthropologist's data are historical, but they're historical in a very narrow time slice, but he goes very deep. So his goal is to really understand the layers of the community, the layers of intimacies, the families, the power structures, the hierarchies, the conflicts, how they're negotiated, the religious beliefs, all of these things. And so ethnographic data can become historical data. The historian can use all of this as well to understand a society. But the challenge with it is you can't really do an anthropology or an ethnography of the past simply because you can't be a participant observer in the past. So this is why anthropologists actually end up relying on historical data sometimes to better understand their communities, especially if the communities they're studying don't have a written tradition or don't keep histories.
So is Margaret Mead, is she an example of that, of like going to live with a certain tribe? And
yeah,
I remember in my studies, like that name came up quite a bit. I was like, but
yeah.
wasn't she also controversial in some way? Wasn't that the thing where like in the 50s or the 60s, like people, or maybe always, like people bring their own like bias with them and they want to see certain things and maybe not write about some of the nasty things that they're witnessing? Or
yeah, absolutely.
Like, and we see that as well, I think, with the Native American, with the way they are depicted. Like you see it in movies, like they're depicted in so many different ways.
Yeah.
It's like, well, the same tribe being depicted so differently, like, how does that make sense?
Yeah.
If not for the bias of the interpreter.
Right. And so this is a perpetual issue in anthropology. A lot of ethnographies will begin with a kind of caveat that, this is my ethnography of these people. And if someone else was to come and do an ethnography, it would look completely different, which is fine, but it can also then call into question the scientific status of the discipline. Because if you're not producing independently verifiable observations, then what are you doing other than, perhaps a form of journalism?
So it doesn't mean like in a way the field could get more objective now that video cameras are so cheap and easy. Like, is it that simple? Like, is this kind of like creating more objective data to look at? Maybe there's also less tribes nowadays to actually study.
Right. Yeah. So there are fewer small scale societies, fewer pre-literate societies. Virtually all human societies, have some degree of literacy and historical awareness. And so that then does call into question what is the object of anthropology. And so some would say it is the study of everyday life, as opposed to history, which is the study of significant events, let's say, in the life of a community. So anthropology would study all the things that normally would never get written about or paid attention to. And so that raises the question of the editorial frame. Like, you have a camera, but what are you choosing to film? And then how are you choosing to edit that film? And this has been extremely controversial in anthropology, because ethnographic filmmaking has been happening for a very long time. And very often, the people portrayed in these ethnographic films don't like it. They don't feel that the films actually represent them the way they understand themselves. And other anthropologists take issue with it, and they say, well, I did fieldwork with these people, and, that's not what I observed, and this is like biased editing or whatever. And so this is the problem with the human sciences in general, because it's not really clear which part is the science. It ends up becoming almost a kind of glorified cultural criticism where, everyone has an opinion, everyone has a point of view, and we fight about it. And then we're dead.
And so what are some of the biases that have, displeased you as you kind of, I assume you probably went in a bit wide-eyed being like, I love this. And was there any beginning point where like something that because I remember for me it was like reading Philip Gurevich write about the genocide in Rwanda. I was like what is this? And like, oh my god, I had no idea that certain societies were so kind of crazy. And so then I was like, maybe I can figure out a way to help. And so then I was like, all right, I'm going to do African studies. But so was there any point like that for you?
Yeah, for me, I think it had a lot to do with being raised bicultural. So my family's from Poland. I'm the first person in my family born in the United States. And I was kind of raised between the two countries. So I would go back a lot, and then I was here. And it was extremely confusing for me. I felt like I had to develop two different cultural personalities. And like I wasn't fully accepted in either one. And so this issue of culture became very interesting to me. I was like, what is this? Why is it so important? And can I figure it out?
Well, yeah. And it's also not like, a lot of the US kind of DNA is kind of Anglo-Saxon. It's kind of more like Western Europe. Like there are, obviously even here in Texas, there's like pretty significant Polish communities, people with Polish heritage. Yeah. But it's still like, I remember traveling to Poland when I was, I don't know, maybe 11. And it just, even for Europeans, it's a different, or Western Europeans, I should say, it's even different. So I imagine like the gap was quite wide for you to experience. And also like the baggage of having lived under communism, which no Americans have had that. I mean, at least people that have been born here. Yeah,
definitely. And that's something that I was very keenly aware of growing up, that my parents, they're both software engineers. They literally came to Texas, to build software and participate in the information technology revolution. That just wasn't possible in communist Poland. And a lot of other things weren't possible there as well. And so I grew up very cognizant of the achievement that a market society is. It doesn't come for free. It has to be built and protected by the people who inherit it. And this was one of to answer your earlier question, one of the kind of jarring experiences I had in higher education and anthropology programs in the United States, because they were so overwhelmingly Marxist that was like the theory of political economy. No other tradition was even countenanced. And so I was like, there's an ideological conformity that is being demanded here. And it's not that, I object to reading Marx. I mean, he's a part of the tradition and the European political economy tradition. But if you're going to read Marx, I mean, there are a lot of other folks you got to read as well, and develop an educated point of view on political economy in the context of a much broader swath of thinkers. And so one of the reasons I ended up kind of moving in a more independent direction with my scholarship is that there weren't a lot of colleagues in anthropology who would even read something that wasn't just automatically anti-capitalist in a specific Marxist tradition.
Are there any moments you remember as like the moment of you becoming aware, like, oh my God, there's this huge bias, or like run-ins that you had with people?
I just remember looking at my syllabus of readings for the first year of my doctoral program, and I was like, this isn't just like a little bit of Marxism. This is like Marxist political economy.
Wow.
And my professors were very well known as Marxist scholars. And so, I tried to talk to them about it a few times. I was like, look, my family immigrated from Poland, like that. We have our own kind of experience with Marxism and communism that I think needs to be taken seriously and by this field. And they're just kind of like, yeah, okay.
yeah. How many million people died under Marxism?
True socialism has never been tried.
Wow. I mean, we can laugh about it, but it's also shocking, right? Because I imagine that I remember recently hearing Jordan Peterson talk about the role of literary critics in the role that they play in our current society, where they interpret literature for us, and in that sense kind of put their own spin on things, and then the people who interpret are often behind the scenes informing all kinds of policies or cultural projects. And I imagine, like, if you produce a movie, you might want to talk. Why not? You're like a wide-eyed, honest to God director, and so you want accurate input on like what is it like? Like maybe you're gonna film the mission in like the 1700s in Latin America, or I recently watched In the Name of the Rose, which is like in the 1300s in northern Italy, right? In the monastic tradition. And then I imagine you might like talk to an anthropologist, like, hey, explain to me how this works.
Yeah.
And like in the name, like honestly, I was struggling to finish watching this movie.
Yeah.
In the Name of the Rose, it's based on a book by Umberto Eco. Like apparently it was super popular in the 80s, that book.
Yeah.
And the way they depict, like all the monks are either like mentally ill or just downright kind of evil or possessed.
Yeah.
And all of them are crazy superstitious. And then of course our Sherlock Holmes character comes in from the outside and he uses reason to figure out who committed the murders. but even like how the relationship with the town, basically the only thing you see is that these monks live in what looks kind of like a castle, and then every now and then they have a bunch of garbage and they throw it out, and then people like who live in squalor, like they come out and like rats, right? They're like getting all these scraps of food, and I'm just kind of like, who told this director that that's what it's like?
Right.
Are your professors, like, are those kind of the people who would inform things like that?
Well, I have to say the cultural clout of anthropologists, who are almost all professors or aspiring to be professors, is perhaps not very high.
Was it higher in the past?
It was higher in the past. So I would say the heyday of anthropology was, in terms of cultural capital, social capital, was probably the mid 20th century, where you had
interesting.
Giants of anthropology, Claude Levi-Strauss, Ratcliffe-Brown, Margaret Mead, Edmund Leach, many others and they're still, considered canonical reading in the field, even though many, don't agree with their theories wholesale anymore. But there's a way in which the field arguably may have become stuck toward the end of the 20th century, where some of the high modernist, let's say, narratives promoted by anthropologists were called into question.
Like, for example?
Like, so there's a theory, an anthropological theory called structuralism, which emerged from the discovery of language as a system. So in 19th century France, Fernand de Saussure published a pretty revolutionary book on the structure of language. And a lot of the social sciences kind of seized upon this as the paradigm for everything in society. So everything in society is symbolic. Symbols have grammars. They have grammatical relations. They have syntagmatic relations, syntactical relations. And the study of society is basically the study of symbols, and figuring out how they are arranged and transformed to try to get at the, in effect, a universal grammar of human society.
Of all human societies.
Yes. Yes.
And so this is a modernist theory.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that that particular theory is being challenged nowadays?
Yeah. So that's high structuralism. And then the post-structuralists came along and started saying, well, there is no universal grammar of the social. You can't actually create a totalizing narrative of society based on symbols and signs. So they began to focus on other things like operations of power, capital, representation, the work of the critic, so the role of the critic or the anthropologist in the construction of the narrative about the other. So to what extent is the ethnography in fact about the anthropologist and not about the people he's studying? And so a lot of what we call today, postmodern or post-structuralist critique was a reaction to these high modern attempts to kind of find universal laws for all people, all societies and all time.
It's funny. Well, yeah, of course you can't do that if you're a Marxist. Like, you're not going to find universal laws because your basis is so flawed.
Well, and that's the thing, Orthodox Marxian theory is a high modernist account. All history is the history of class struggle. And so it is a master narrative for all of humanity about how humanity came from, primitive society to feudal society to bourgeois society, capitalist society, and then how the internal contradictions of each stage of the evolution of human societies eventually resolve themselves in the next stage. And the final stage is communism. I
wish I would have known that because I tried, reading Mead and reading a few other probably anthropology related books. And I got so confused. And I think maybe I'm just dumb, but it could be that I just didn't understand that this whole Marxian framework was just assumed.
Well, in the case of Mead, I don't think she was actually a Marxist. There were many non-Marxist anthropologists. In fact, Ratcliffe-Brown, for example, was known as the anarchist anthropologist. He's a British anthropologist of the structural functionalist school. And one of the reasons he became an anthropologist is because he was interested in how stateless societies govern themselves. So he was very skeptical of the state, fully rejected the hierarchy, monarchical hierarchy in the United Kingdom, and believed that so-called primitive peoples had something to teach us about human freedom and self-organization.
The noble savage.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, he was looking for universal laws of society so that we could get to a place where we don't need the state. We can self-govern, in effect, lawfully because we understand what the principles are for organizing
And
human social life.
do you think he actually, did he strike gold at some point?
I think he advanced the field in extraordinary ways. But to date, nothing that has been proposed as a universal law of human society has been shown to be truly universal. And so this is the question. And for this reason, a lot of anthropologists have suggested we shouldn't even seek for the universal. We shouldn't ask that. It's all just particulars in all directions. And I think that's not true either. I actually think there are universals, and there is a lawfulness to human sociality, but we perhaps don't have the tools yet to sufficiently describe what those are.
Well, and it seems like a lot of these, I could be wrong, but it seems like a lot of their approach, like given how they're modernist, is that they so believe in empiricism and like, oh, you just collect enough data and then somehow the truth will emerge from the data. Whereas on the other side, there is Mises, who is much more, Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian school tradition, much more in the kind of Aristotelian tradition, who are like, no, you can actually kind of hypothesize in the abstract, and then you can discover laws and say, if these things happen, then those things will follow. And then, of course, we empiricists can have a debate about, well, did this thing actually happen in that case or not? But at least you're not, you do have some laws.
Right. And all observation is already being funneled through the categories that the scientist, the observing person, is using to make use of the world. So even what counts as evidence is selected. They have to decide what they're paying attention to, why, what it means. There's interpretation, and their preconceptions, presuppositions often import meanings and values to observed phenomena that are not there in the phenomena themselves. And so, what the Austrians, I think, are rightfully pointing to is that science actually doesn't begin in the field. It begins in the mind of the scientist. The scientist has to constantly be rigorously thinking and then updating their presumptions, their categories, their conclusions based on the truth that they are looking to find.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about Graeber because he wrote this book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. He's probably the most famous anthropologist of, the last couple decades. And he seems to have this theory that money emerged from barter. And you disagree with that. And you actually, for the audience, me and Natalie have both been involved. Natalie, much more intensely in a project called the Satoshi Papers, which is a bundle of academic papers that are kind of coming from the Bitcoin world, in focused on various disciplines. And so you contributed one paper. What's the name again of your paper?
Toward an Anthropological Theory of Money. Right.
And so in that paper, you kind of go head to head with Graeber, or at least you're showing the difference in point of view between Graeber and then one of our guys. Is that right?
Yeah.
So yeah, what's your take on Graeber's view of money?
Yeah, Graeber is he's very influential in anthropological theories of money, mostly because he's one of the few who have made it explicitly his mission to define one. And so, money has been a topic of anthropological interest for a very long time, but Graeber has sort of done the most synthetic work to try to pull together the different anthropological theories of money into a theory. And then he published it as a popular book called Debt. And so he got a massive readership. He is one of the rare anthropologists who became a kind of celebrity in addition to, a professor at a university. And he did influence culture. In fact, Francis Ford Coppola's movie megalopolis was in part directly influenced.
Really?
By
I had no
Graeber.
idea. Did you see it? I haven't seen it yet.
I did. Yes.
Wow. I remember some of the imagery looked pretty dystopian.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fable. You have to think of it almost like a Greek myth. Cause it's all the characters are very, caricatured almost, like the aesthetics are extremely stark. There's a lot of really direct symbolism. Yeah, it's a very interesting film. And so Graeber has influenced the culture in a number of ways. And I kind of felt an obligation to decisively and definitively take him down because he's so wrong about money. He's just wrong. There are a lot of spheres of debate around money, but his theory that all money is credit, including commodity money, by the way, is simply empirically not the case.
So he would try to argue, if I live in the 1800s and I have here in Texas and I have 20 gold coins, he would argue that that's credit.
Yes, that gold coin is really an IOU.
And so, but then a house would be credit, or a horse. So like
Right.
Any possession could be credit.
Right. And so this is where it all falls down. I mean, he doesn't have, because he doesn't want to deign to give economics even a little bit, like even an inch. He doesn't want to go into price theory. So completely rejects the logic of supply and demand as mechanisms for pricing commodities. So, if you acknowledge that, let's say, a gold coin functions both as a medium of exchange and as a commodity, or it has commodity value, well, then it's
Commodity as in like utility, or
yeah,
right,
yeah.
right, yeah.
So gold is a commodity because it has utility,
Right.
At the very least aesthetic utility, but also industrial utility. If he were to acknowledge that, then he would have to talk about market pricing.
Like give credibility to the classical economists. And,
Right.
But what is his moral? Like there seems like to put out something like that's so brazen and wrong,
Yeah.
and to build your whole kind of career around it. Maybe that's taking it too far, but at least, like the gist of his most famous book, is there some kind of moral judgment behind that? Like, does he kind of want to imply like, oh, money is kind of evil,
Yeah.
or do you feel
Absolutely.
that? Or
I mean, his book is a moral polemic against money.
Wow.
Which this is the part that I think a lot of his readers don't pick up. But this is where his anarchism comes out. He believes money is a creation of the state. He also believes markets are creations of the state. So, in effect, the state needing to go to war is what drove it to mint money, to mint the first coins. And in the introduction of money, it created markets. So he actually, he doesn't see markets as existing without money. And he wants to abolish all of them. So he wants to abolish money, markets, and the state.
That is so radical.
Yeah.
That is so radical. Wow. I'm shocked, because you can find this book everywhere. And so I assume he's smart enough to not just put it into words the way you just did.
Right.
It's kind of like woven in, or maybe there's like more obscure papers that he wrote where he's a bit more clear about what he means. But it's just so shocking to me that, I for my speech that I did in Belgium last year, I was researching Marx, and it really seems that Marx just took the biblical story of man in paradise and then the fall of man, and warped it and said that, the fall of man, the origin of all sin is that we started having property. Like that property itself is like the at the heart of all evil in the world. And so that, then it would also make sense that Graeber is just like, well, money is property and therefore it's evil, but I have to find a way in modern society to word it in a way that people get that it's evil, even though I'm not just going to come out and say that.
Yeah. Right.
And therefore I'm going to call it credit, which is because everybody feels like, being in debt is kind of dirty, who wants to be in debt?
Right.
It's so weird though. Like, so he would really say like somebody who has, a farm and land and, 1,000 gold coins buried in his backyard, that's like a debtor.
In effect, yes, that everything he has, all of these assets are just forms of credit. And so,
but you owe it to whom?
Right.
Does he have an answer? To whom do you owe that?
That is a fantastic
to society, probably, like in general.
Yeah, no, it very quickly gets into religion at that point. Everyone's a cosmic debtor in some religious sense, where he goes into various mythologies, like Hindu mythologies, Southeast Asian mythologies, African mythologies around debt. But it doesn't answer the question precisely, which is, so what settles a debt? Like,
right. Yeah.
And he would say, and it took me quite some digging through his argument to finally get to this, but he would say that debt settlement is a decision by powerful social actors. So the state and the wealthy private interests collude to place everyone else into debt, and then they just keep adding notches to the ledger. Like, they, in effect, decide when or if any of these debts are ever settled, and lo and behold, they tend not to be. So this is his class analysis.
So he would probably, if he looked at, he passed away, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if he were to, and of course we can't put words in his mouth, but like from based on that theory, if he were to look at South Africa today, he would probably be like, oh, wow, like, finally we have a government who is understanding that, property is really kind of evil. And, we need to disown these farmers. We need to unburden them from their debt, and take the farms and give it back, quote unquote, to society, even though what's really happening is just confiscation and destruction of property and all those things.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And so at some point, he actually literally on Twitter had a debate with Nick Szabo, right? Yeah. So Nick Szabo is like our guy who, pioneered libertarian theory and definitely has a lot of interest in the anthropological field, writing about the origins of money and things like that. And so that's part of what your paper is about, right? About those interactions between Nick Szabo, who, I believe he's definitely mentioned by Satoshi, if not in the white paper itself, as an inspiration for Bitcoin. Yeah. His what was it, BitGold? Was that his original idea?
That sounds right.
BitGold, I think, was what it was called. So basically, he was writing in the 90s about e-gold, and then, Bitcoin kind of became that. But so, yeah, can you tell me a bit more about how that debate went? Yeah,
so interestingly, it was kicked off by a journalist named Michael Casey, who was writing, he wrote for many years for the Wall Street Journal, and then I believe CoinDesk became the editor of CoinDesk. So he made a claim, quote tweeting Vitalik, about how money, I believe it's that money has to be a unit of account before it can be a store of value and a medium of exchange.
Wait, so you're saying that Vitalik Buterin, creator of Ethereum, somehow made a mistake about the nature of money?
Could be.
That's surprising.
Could be. A controversial claim. So anyway, Mike quote tweeted him approvingly, and this prompted Nick Szabo to respond in a manner that was disagreeing. Mike invoked Graeber's theory of money, so in debt. And that then kicked off a Twitter debate that actually pulled in Graeber, pulled in Elaine O, a number of other Bitcoiners, and then also a lot of anthropologists from around the world who started like chiming in, defending Graeber. So it became this like kerfuffle. And I remember reading this. This was like back in 2017 or 18. I don't remember, but years ago. And I remember thinking, okay, someone needs to actually bring Graeber's ideas into dialogue with Nick Szabo's, because, they can't resolve this together on Twitter. But maybe if I were to actually read their work more in depth, I could find areas of commonality and overlap. So that's what I started to do. But the closer I read Graeber, the more apparent it became to me that he's in effect a modern monetary theorist. I mean, that is his theory of money. And he never cites MMT. He doesn't refer to it ever.
Oh, that's Kelsey, right? So that's the lady who says that debt is great and we can always run more deficits, so we don't have to worry about anything, and governments never need to pay down their debt, right?
Yeah, that the only time debt becomes problematic is when it outpaces the productive capacity of the economy. But she sees that as employment. So it's always this race between the money supply and employment, which is very neatly resolved in her theory by just getting the government to employ more people. And so MMT basically becomes a massive government jobs program that in her mind, in Kelton's mind, genuinely is how the economy grows. I mean, it's horrific, but they have no account of productivity that isn't just, wages being exchanged for labor.
Man, so she's kind of saying, like, yes, it is, triangle shaped and pyramid shaped, but it's not a Ponzi scheme because you can always make a bigger base and, like, find more people to employ.
That's right. You control the pyramid if you're the government.
Oh, right.
So, like,
so what you found is that Graeber's ideas, when it comes to monetary theory, most closely aligned with this modern monetary theory.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yep. No, he takes, which is funny, he hates economists. He dismisses the entire discipline of economics as, foolishness. That's never taught us anything about anything. But he relies on very specific economists to make his argument about money. And
Wow.
Those are Alfred Knopf, who wrote The State Theory of Money, German economist. Alfred Mitchell Innes, the Credit Theory of Money, British economist, and Keynes.
Yeah. John Maynard Keynes.
Yeah. So those are the three economists that he relies on.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, cherry picking, it's very convenient, right? If you have a preconceived notion of the way things should be, then you can always find some writer, some theorist, some economist who agrees with you.
Yeah.
And then you can still grandstand and dismiss the whole field. Wow, that's fascinating. And I assume the way the politics work and the way the kind of self-selection mechanism works in the field of anthropology, that there just isn't there aren't a lot of brains who will just kind of do what you did and really try to get to the bottom, because you don't want to offend the dean of your discipline, or I assume, right? Maybe now the time is ripe, now that he passed away, and that it's also so clear, with Bitcoin, $2 trillion value.
Right.
A lot of Austrian economists have also been challenged to their notion of what money ought to be. And all of a sudden, here's this real animal that's behaving differently than what they thought it would be.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. it's a question also of publication. So it's pretty much impossible, I would suggest, to get published in an anthropological journal if you have an Austrian point of view on money. Like the peer review process is also a process of enforcing a certain kind of ideological conformity. And this is why we published the Satoshi papers independently, because we're not yet at the place where a traditional academic press would take arguments like this seriously. But because we've done it now we've opened the door. And so there will be a lot of academics, including anthropologists, reading this stuff. And whether or not they agree with it, we've shifted the Overton window. And so I suspect within a few years, it actually will become more common for anthropologists to publish on these topics.
So yeah, that brings us to academia in general. I kind of want to, I'm curious to ask, what's your general defense of the academic, the institution of academics? Because I think just how like it happened in the past, there's certain institutions and people look at them, there's a lot wrong with them. And then it's tempting to be like, let's just throw it all away.
Yeah.
Throw it all away and do our own thing, do it differently, whatever. It's kind of like that iconoclasm impulse.
Yeah.
But so, in the most general sense, what do you, especially when it comes to the human sciences, where do you feel is the value? As, like, let's say that we have people involved that have integrity, what is the value of the academic disciplines?
The academic disciplines have sketched out research programs for rigorous engagement with fundamental questions about human societies, human beings as individuals and in society. And those questions and research programs persist to this day. They are open. They are vast horizons of undiscovered possibilities. What has happened is that the institutions that were charged with taking up those missions, those vocational callings, have arguably drifted away from them. So they are no longer, like in the case of anthropology, solving for a rigorous and comprehensive account of human beings in their day-to-day social life. That's a polemical claim, but it also gives us a place to refound from. So, that's always the question. Do you reform or do you refound?
And I want to get into that, but I want to back up first a little more because I'll kind of go back to the kind of foundational question. As I'm hearing you talk, I realize that the way I see it is that there's this kind of division of labor where things just happen in society, they leave traces, and then there's actors in everyday life or in, powerful people who want to make changes. And then there's popular books that will have ideas about what should change and how you should think about things. And some of those books are history books and like, hey, here you can learn from the past. But those popular book writers, if they're any good, will read the source material produced by the scientists, the social scientists. They'll look at all kinds of papers. Like I'm seeing a lot of blog posts now, for example, about natalism. Like, oh, there's a decline in how many children people have, and therefore, it's a concern that our, the overall population is on the decline, which obviously is happening. And the best popular works, they always are quoting from all these papers. And so I don't know, just kind of like, as I'm thinking out loud, I think that's where I see a lot of the value, is that kind of like you go from the clay that's just all the data to making bricks.
Yeah.
And if they're any good, then, builders can use those bricks to make buildings.
That's right. That's exactly right. Like if you're studying calculus today, if you're learning calculus, you don't have to go back and read Leibniz, because Leibniz laid down the foundations that subsequent generations have built on top of, so that we don't have to start over in every generation. And that literally is the definition of culture. According to Alfred Kroeber, another very influential anthropologist, that culture is knowledge and information that is inherited outside of the mechanism of genetic transmission. So genetic transmission is one way of passing down knowledge from generation to generation. Culture is another.
It's mimetic transition, or
right.
Mimetic
and innovative.
Yeah.
And so that's what makes culture so powerful. It is a gene-independent mode of learning. And so regardless of what your genetic inheritance is, you have access as a human being to the entire corpus of human culture in all places and all times. The question is just, you can't possibly do that. Like, one person can't possibly access, metabolize, become an expert in it all, become enculturated in it all. So where are you going to localize yourself? And to some extent that is answered for you by, your parents, the time and place that you're born, how you're raised. But as you become a more autonomous individual, you get to choose more and more and direct your own inheritance of culture. So you begin to steer yourself in the direction of those cultural objects that are most meaningful to you. And some of those objects are scientific objects. In other words, they represent knowledge that is grounded and justified in ways that are objectively verifiable and reproducible by people, regardless of which local cultures they may come from. And so in this way, science becomes the inheritance of all of humanity, and why it's buildable across time.
Yeah. And so now we have the issue where so many of these bricks are, they just fall apart because they don't have the right components. They looks like they're made out of cardboard often, and we want real bricks.
Right.
And so do we refactor the factories, or do we build new factories, or both? Like, is it? What's your take on, reform? Like how when you think about, they always say follow the money. Like that is obviously a huge factor in how institutions work, is that they are trying to do what the source of, they want to stay alive, so they try to keep adhering to whatever the funding source is implying that they should keep doing. And so is it enough that there's going to be new ways of funding universities to kind of change them from within, or do we need completely new what's your take?
Yeah. Well, the most important thing about an institution is its mission. So what is it about? What is it striving to do? And you can see that in its actions over time, regardless of what it states. So the university as an ideal emerged during the Middle Ages as a collegial forum, the collegium, of scientists seeking a certain kind of truth together, as a community.
I remember learning that the word university comes from Universitas Scholarium et Magistrorum, which is like the community of students and teachers.
Yeah.
And that there was even, so it was almost like a social gathering more than the way we think of it now, is like somebody's in charge and it was much more horizontal, I think, initially than the way we think of it now.
Yeah. Some of the earliest universities were they were not permanent structures. They were just, in effect, what we would call today conferences of scholars coming together for certain periods of time. And then over time, it became apparent that pedagogy, the nurturance of students, the making of masters, of magisters, required a certain kind of rootedness in place and time, and structures and institutions began to be built around that. That university structure can be deployed toward the pursuit of truth, but it can also be deployed toward things like social reproduction. So think of the finishing school, for example. This used to be how like young women were socialized.
You'd learn how to sew, and you'd learn how to do all kinds of households, acquire household skills, right? Mm-hmm. Finishing school, yeah.
Right. You learned how to become a socially legible, productive member of society. And that has value as well, but it's not the same thing as search for truth, let alone scientific truth, right? And so I think the problem with the university form today is that it has started solving for many different things. Class reproduction. I need to signal that I am of a certain class, that I went to college, that I finished college, or I, fulfill my parents' ambitions to have gone to college by doing this. I'm going to college to get a job. So it's a vocational program. That's also not the same thing as, either a finishing school or a scientific and research establishment. So it's universities trying to do too many things and being too many things to too many people that have muddied their mission. And as a result, they do everything in a mediocre way, but nothing in a great way. And those are the conditions under which stagnation and decline happens.
Yeah, and tenure, like how hard is it to get fired? There's this movie that I rewatched recently, Smart People. Did you ever see that?
Mm-mm.
Oh my God, you got to see it. It's about this college professor, probably in Boston. He's like super pedantic and like super rude. And I looked up who wrote the screenplay, and it actually is a Harvard college professor who focuses on screenwriting. Like but it's funny that he kind of wrote about his own world.
Yeah.
And part of what the movie shows is just how impossible it is to get fired, I think, from once you got tenure, you're locked in.
Right. And that the academic institution of tenure was purposefully designed to protect a kind of absolute independence of inquiry that would not succumb to social pressure, to pressures from donors, from parents, from students, from the administration. It was supposed to give the scholar a kind of absolute freedom. And it sometimes has been used that way, and other times it's been used as a kind of decadent way of checking out, of abusing power, of just, grifting. And so the question of character then becomes central. What kinds of people are being nurtured and created by the university system? Are these people capable of living up to the mission of the university, even if they get to, the final stage, which is like tenured professorship?
Yeah, I want to even push back to tenure in general, because I remember reading, like, for example, about Peter Abelard, I think, in what is that, the 1200s, and so it's like the time of the early universities, and he would just go to, a university where some professor was teaching, and he would just, because it was scholasticism, it was like debating culture was very central, and he would just debate them to the floor and win the arguments. And then, once he won, he would move on and go to another place and do the same thing. And so eventually he was just so noticed that students started following him, and he had his own school. And so I don't know, like, also entrepreneurs never get tenure, right? If you start a business, like, you can never say like, oh, well, now you're forced to be my customer forever.
Right.
Or I'm entitled to always having new customers.
Right.
So I don't even know if it's such a good idea to have tenure in general. Like, you can get a grant and then maybe you can kind of stay on until that grant is finished or something. But it just strikes me as such a, like, the psychological mechanism of that, like knowing that you're locked in until the time of your 65 or something.
Yeah.
How could that not kind of inadvertently create some laziness, for example?
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your take on tenure?
Well, my take is that it's a condition, but not a guarantee of outcomes. And so what it does is it creates the possibility for someone like Higgs, alone in his room in Scotland, working for 20 years with a pencil and paper to discover the Higgs boson. I mean, he never could have done that without tenure.
Well, why not? I mean, like, aren't there a lot of, like Renaissance luminaries who just they lived on a stipend that they got from some sponsor who just liked their work. Right. I was like, hey, keep going, like, write another book. Right. And they would just get it. And like, that was not tenure, but they did give them continuity over a long period of time.
Yeah. I mean, it's patronage, right?
Right. So, yeah.
Whether your patronage comes from, a prince or a wealthy industrialist or an endowed university, it's still a structure of patronage. And so that's the question: is what are these patrons patronizing? Right.
Yeah. And so I think that's where I would argue, like, well, it shouldn't be the government. The government should not be a patron of, because it has a vested interest in a very material set of, circumstances that has to do with power and all kinds of things. And so it doesn't seem like a good source for funding patronage wise. Maybe that's part of the, because it's so tempting to always operate in the current structure, which especially in Europe, which is why I was such a horrible student. I dropped out like 4 or 5 times, because all the higher learning institutions are funded by the government, and then they become these kind of post offices, these like bureaucratic giants that are just, they produce papers, sure, but how valuable are those papers? And they produce tenure professors, sure, but how much are they actually contributing?
Right.
Like here in town, like UATX, like they started a new university with, I don't know, I think they didn't even have a lot of funding when they announced this program, and they were like, look, we're gonna have a summer school, and we're gonna feature all these brilliant professors who have been canceled at all kinds of universities.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just feel that it feels like change is in the air.
Yep.
And I'm asking about funding because, you and I both are involved in Bitcoin. We love Bitcoin. And we both think that it's, I mean, I don't know if you agree, but I think it's going to, we're going to live on a Bitcoin standard probably within our lifetime, which means that there's going to be a huge potential source of funding for all kinds of things. Maybe early on people will buy some more Lamborghinis, but down the road, as people get older, they're going to want to kind of leave a legacy.
Right.
So I guess, we were talking about reform. And so, okay, but one thing that I remember that surprised me when I was in Guatemala, I went to University of Francisco Marroquin I stayed there for like a month back in 2014. And I don't know how much they are like a typical university, but what really struck me is that, and they are a private university, is that it's almost like an umbrella. And then there's a lot of little institutes within the university, sometimes who are separately funded, or it's almost like a I don't know, an umbrella for intellectual startups is what it kind of felt like. And so do you think that's true for high quality universities in general? And then do you think is that maybe a way that change could happen? Is one of these new startups happens to be producing amazing quality research, and then they can still be under an umbrella of kind of old and stodgy and bureaucratic, but there's a spark there.
Yeah.
Do you think that's naive, or do you think that's how it's going to go?
I mean, that's definitely one path of reform. So like this has been a pattern, what you just described, setting up institutions at established universities by wealthy donors who are entrepreneurial enough that they see something is missing in the curriculum of the university, and they want to fund specific types of research. They can't do that if they just give directly to the university, because every department is governed by the faculty of that department. And so the faculty, there's a thing about university governance. Faculty actually have a very strong say in all of the academic programming of the university. And so if the faculty doesn't like an idea...
Is that like the board, or what is the faculty?
The teachers, the professors of that department. So if you're a professor of history at the University of Chicago, you are faculty, and you govern the history department, in effect. So there's a chair of the department, and there are other administrative roles, and generally the faculty cycle through these roles. So there's a lot of power in university faculty. That power can also create orthodoxies, ideological, political, whatever, that become very hard to break through. And simply hiring more faculty may not be an option. And, if they're tenured, it's very difficult to fire them, almost impossible. And so the creation of institutes has become a way for entrepreneurial donors to intervene in this governance structure by setting up new institutes within the university that can hire new faculty, that can, bring in faculty from multiple different departments who, may be more aligned with the mission of the institute than with their own department, and create their own research programs. Now, legacy faculty is not happy about this.
But you're saying that's a change that's been happening
yes,
since
yes.
when, or what?
The rate of creation of institutes at universities has been accelerating for the past few decades. I don't know what the numbers are, but there was recently an op-ed for the Chronicle of Higher Education by a faculty member from the University of Chicago in response to yet another institute being created there, who was basically saying that this is just a way of getting around faculty governance, and it's undermining the mission of the university from her point of view. But it is happening. That said, it's limited in its effectiveness, because you are using the body of existing institutions who can only move at the pace they can move at, and they can only do what they can do. And so this is why entrepreneurial founders, like the founders of UATX, are saying, screw that. We're not going to bother with existing universities. We're going to found our own. This is a startup university. And there are examples of these across the world.
Yeah, like UATX apparently was the first new private university in the state of Texas since 1960, I believe. So that's 65 years.
Yeah.
New institutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, time will tell, like, and I imagine you want both, right? Because having a new school is going, like, the old school that is in the same town, they're going to notice that there's a new school doing new things. And then there probably is going to be a reaction where it's like, oh, maybe we got to catch up, or maybe we got to. So I think the interplay can be really interesting.
Yeah. No, it's critical. This is the competition for resources, students, tuition dollars, donors, attention, prestige. This is the kind of thing that spurs innovation and progress.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Let me look at what else I wrote down about these papers that are in the Satoshi papers. Well, yeah, one of the papers talks about warfare, right? And how easy money, easy wars is the title. It's a Sarah Krebs's paper.
Yeah.
And it really does seem like there's a pattern where the easier it is for the government to get their hands on fresh money without having to ask permission to, the population, the more likely you'll have very long, protracted wars. And so then the question becomes, if we change the money, is that going to change the nature of warfare? Is it going to make wars shorter? Like, for example, the current war in Ukraine, like, do you think it would happen the way it's happening under a Bitcoin standard? Like, how do you think that would have, that's maybe a far out there question, but what's your take on that?
Yeah. So, the real question is whether the state can be induced to constrain its own spending. And, I think some of the proposals for a Bitcoin standard or a Bitcoin reserve have been hopeful that introducing this new form of sound money will somehow spur a motivation on the part of the state to constrain itself. I am less hopeful for that than I think maybe some others are.
So what are your concerns about how it might not be like the silver bullet?
Well, I think, once governments discovered their ability to deficit finance by printing money, basically once fiat currencies were introduced, the writing was already on the wall. This spending is going to continue ballooning until sovereign credit collapse. And we don't know exactly when that will be or what the markers are of it. But when it happens suddenly and decisively.
So what I'm hearing is that you're not necessarily saying under Bitcoin standard, we're going to have the same kind of wars. You're just saying we're not there yet. And, it's a long way to transition. So let me try and push back. Because if you look at the debt situation, what is it now? Like 35 trillion in debt is the US, something like that. And then unfunded liabilities, a bunch more. If you look at the plans that they have in like potentially trying to address this, it seems like they could be able to raise more money by issuing Bitcoin linked bonds, right? Where basically there's a kick where the money that you borrow, you immediately buy some Bitcoin from that, and then you give some kickback to whoever is lending you that money. That's the buyer of the bonds, because that's the issue. The government can only borrow so much as they're willing buyers for the debt. And if you make it entirely self-dealing, then the market figures it out, and it calls bluff, and your money hyperinflates. So you kind of need that interaction. So, issuing Bitcoin linked bonds, I think probably would kind of, on the one hand, there's a way out of the debt situation. Like you can actually, draw down, or reduce the debt over time. But on the other hand, it would introduce discipline, more discipline, because you can't just issue these Bitcoin bonds forever. Like you see that in history when you even under hard money, governments could borrow, but there was always this kind of limit. But so I guess I don't know. I think that could be a form of discipline where we kind of more slowly transition towards another system. And I mean, what happened in France was that eventually the paper money was just so, or the cash money was just so undesirable that people just switched, and the government bonds became the de facto money. Like the assignats actually were government bonds.
Yeah.
And of course that went wrong as well. But so, yeah, I think there's a possibility where we just have regular dollars and then people just gradually lose more and more interest in those because the inflation is too high. It doesn't make sense. Whereas if you own the bonds, they're very liquid, and there's a Bitcoin element to it. Maybe institutions would hold on to that.
Yeah. That's similar to an argument made in one of the Satoshi papers called Bitcoin and Credit, which is looking at the question of, what credit would look like on a Bitcoin standard,
right?
Or Bitcoin denominated credit. And the author's proposal is that the rate of credit issuance would dramatically decline from what it is today. One of the reasons we have, such an explosion of debt is because credit is so easy to come by. And so by actually making certain forms of credit redeemable for or convertible into a hard asset like Bitcoin, you still preserve a credit economy, but you tie it much more closely to nearer term economic productivity and genuine value creation. That's his argument. There needs to be a disciplining of credit in the world. So, the question of to what extent is that possible if fiat denominated credit continues to still be so easy? That's the open question.
Right. So we're here in the US. Strategic Bitcoin Reserve has been announced. Well, I guess I'm curious, what's your take on that, first of all? Because that was to me, it was very surprising that it actually happened. And of course, people say like, oh, they're not actually spending dollars yet to buy some. This is just to kind of preserve what's there. But it does feel quite monumental to me. Mm-hmm. How did it land for you when you saw that it was there?
I think, the most hopeful aspect of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is that it is the first stage of the creation of a sovereign wealth fund in the United States, which it's not a sovereign wealth fund, but it is beginning to move in that direction. And I think that is just a prudent use of statecraft.
Like a war chest.
Yeah, but for the people. Mm-hmm. I think what Norway did with its sovereign wealth fund, the Gulf countries, even the state of Alaska, which pays the oil dividend. These are ways of socializing gains for the people, not just losses, which has been the American paradigm, unfortunately. That's what a bailout is. It's the socialization of losses, of private losses. So that I think there's real value there, but the question is just, what is the implementation actually going to look like on a time horizon of, 5, 10, 30 years? That's big unknown.
And don't you think that smaller states and smaller political entities will be better at managing their own strategic Bitcoin reserves? Like I think now we had approval of the bill here in Texas. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the way Bitcoin began was just every individual builds his own strategic Bitcoin reserve. Right. You hodl Bitcoin, and then it becomes a source of kind of stability for your family. And then maybe, a local community could think about the same thing, or businesses. But now all of a sudden we're at the largest level, mm-hmm. An empire who's building a stash of Bitcoin. Yeah. Yeah. Who do you think in the long run is going to be best at kind of, managing reserves like that? Mm-hmm. Like where do you think most Bitcoin is going to kind of aggregate over the long that's something I've been thinking about, because one of the things that the Satoshi papers also write about, I think in your paper as well, is kind of like a lot of our governments feel like a lot of these structures feel outdated, and there seems to be a need for refounding. But with new money, maybe there's just different dynamics, and maybe everything is going to look different as well. You know, maybe there's too much, maybe it's top heavy and we have too much power on the national level, and some of that power, maybe in the form of money, needs to go more to the foundation of society. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean,
it's one thing to want it to happen, but it's another thing. It's like, are the incentives there? Like, is it likely?
Yeah. Well, this is the thing about power is, you know, he who has it shall have more. It's a virtuous cycle for the powerful and a vicious cycle for those without it. And so the primary criticism of Bitcoin from the left is that it's not a redistributive project, that so much Bitcoin ownership is concentrated in the hands of so few. It's the wealth concentration in Bitcoin is actually much more stark than the wealth concentration in the fiat world. And so...
Is that so, though?
Yes, like dramatically so.
Well, yeah, but Bitcoin is only 15 years old. I mean, like, of course, if, you know, like the ownership of Microsoft's equity, you know, in the first 10 years of that company was also extremely, you know, limited to the founders. Yep.
But so, you know, Avik Roy in his paper for the Satoshi Papers, which is called "Then They Fight You," is saying that this is why Bitcoiners need to be politically engaged, because there will be a moment politically, if Bitcoin succeeds and continues to appreciate in value, where a lot of Americans are going to start calling for confiscation, redistribution, either one or the other or both, out of, you know, resentment and concern that the vast majority of people don't have it. And so Avik is suggesting that we actually need to, you know, work on policy that continues to drive the economic engine of the United States, so that the floor continues to be raised, to preclude a kind of, you know, violent, perhaps, confiscation of assets.
So it's kind of like there's these government institutions, and instead of us being like anarchist Bitcoiners being like, screw you guys, I'm going to live on my farm and have a happy life, we're going to try and help educate on all levels of politics. Like, hey, like this, you know, what this can mean for your institution, for your government, so that we have a more kind of more elegant or less rowdy transition to this new system where, you know, the federal government actually has 500,000 Bitcoin and they can actually get things done. And, you know, if there's a hurricane, they can actually help out and those kind of things.
Right.
I can see that argument. I mean, Pierre was in here a few days ago, and his take is just kind of like the world needs to get Bitcoinified, and of course we got to Bitcoinify politics as well. Like there's no reason not to. Like they're gonna then discover the incentives that are built into Bitcoin as well, which is prudence and low time preference and those kind of things. But yeah, it is interesting from, you know, your point of view of like, oh, you know, maybe there's a way to have less social unrest, because it is true, you know, scarcity breeds social unrest and breeds riots, and you know, like the reason why the French Revolution happened was people didn't have bread to eat.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, I can see that. What's your take on what's happening in Europe nowadays?
Well, which thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess talking about unrest, you know, talking about kind of institutions that seem to be less and less performative, failed states. I think it's starting to become pretty fair to call a lot of the governments in Europe like failed governments. They just cannot fulfill their promises. And and they seem to be focused on very strange things other than like, you know, helping their own people. And there seems to be a lot of kind of, you know, the way justice is administered, like there's like a two-tier system, seems like, in many ways. I mean, coming from Eastern Europe that's lived under communism, like, do you see any parallels happening there?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because the calcification of institutions is happening in the quote unquote capitalist West, just as it did in the Soviet Union and in communist countries. There is a entrenchment of an existing elite that leverages bureaucratic power, the power of the state, to perpetuate itself and its own interests. And so, I mean, what was the radicalism of the American founding project, the founding fathers? It was a rejection of aristocracy, by which they basically meant hereditary class rule. It kills merit. It kills innovation. It kills imagination, and it becomes tyrannical. Rule by the few, you know, ensconced in their positions of power. And so, what we're seeing is that there's always a limit to the ability of elites in any period of history to consume resources. So the more they consume, and elites in every society vastly overconsume relative to everyone else, the more they consume, the more pressure they put on their resource base, to the point where they can no longer fulfill what is the universal aspiration of elites, which is to advance their children even higher up the status hierarchy than they themselves are. And so once the children of elites stop being able to take for granted even status parity, once they start to lose status, that's when civilizations tend to move into periods of decline and often warfare. And so the way that this tends to manifest, and I'm paraphrasing now Peter Turchin's arguments, is that civil wars and political conflicts tend to be primarily intra-elite conflicts, in which a faction of outsider elites mobilizes the, you know, non-elites, the masses or whatever, behind their own ambition for power and status. And so these tend to be revolutionary movements or turnovers of dynasties, you know, new dynasties or whatever are created. New elites come into power. There may be a period of prosperity again, but eventually the elite class becomes top heavy again. It begins over consuming resources. And then the cycle repeats itself again and again. And so how do we get out of the cycle? Well, candidly, economic growth is the only way. You have to continue growing the resource base.
Well, and that's hard if the ideology of the elites seems to be, you know, they're talking about degrowth.
Right.
They're talking about pre-bunking, which is basically propaganda. It's like we got to be ahead of the, you know, we debunking is
right.
is after the fact. No, we gotta be ahead of the disinformation. So yeah, we have censorship. We have you know, the climate religion, I think you can almost call it. And so there is almost like a culture of self-punishment in Europe. I wonder, right? I mean, because Christianity was so important for so long, and dealing with guilt was such a core part of that. I wonder if, you know, if you yank out Christianity and you just leave a void, it's like people they gravitate towards that. But we got to be guilty somehow. And so, oh yeah, it's that we created global warming, like, oh, you know, or you know, we grew too much, you know, we need to degrow. But so yeah, it seems that the current elites, they just don't have what it takes to allow for growth to happen. Because it's not like we would expect elites to produce the growth. It's just they would kind of step out of the way a little bit, let the entrepreneurs like do their thing and build new ways of generating electricity and those kind of things. So it almost feels like there's a kind of a checkmate stuckness. The tectonic plates are pressing against each other. And I don't know, it to me, it feels like war is in the air somehow, there's the way they responded to Zelensky, that meeting of Zelensky and Trump, and the way Europe responded to that, it was almost like, no, we're going to spend $2 trillion and kick the Russians' ass. And that's like very, very bellicose. It's like, what?
Right.
And I don't know if necessarily that's what's going to materialize. I just wonder, like, are we seeing just the emotional reality, like that war is somehow starting to bubble up and we don't know what it's going to look like, but I don't know. I'm worried about it. I'm worried about whether it's civil war or other types of war. Do you think about it that way as well? Like that there's this stuckness?
Certainly, yeah. There's a commitment on the part of the Brussels consensus to, on the internal front, to ruling undemocratically. So that they've basically now made it an open policy that if candidates from certain parties win elections, those elections will be nullified throughout the EU.
That's wild.
That's going to piss off a lot of Europeans in their countries, and they will make that very known. So the potential for civil unrest that, my democracy was taken away from me and I didn't even know it, that's already on the table. And then the foreign wars with foreign aggressors have revealed the lack actually of a coherent European foreign policy and a reassertion of national policy. So you have, France and the UK saying, yes, we're going to support Ukraine. And you have Italy saying, absolutely not. No, you can't have my soldiers. And so there's a lot of, I think on the foreign policy side, there's a lot of bluster right now in Europe, but it's going to take them a long time before they're capable of doing the things that they say they're going to do. And it's like the trust fund kid who was just cut off. Like,
right.
They're trying to prove they're a big boy and, they can stand up to daddy and, well, they haven't done anything yet.
Yep.
I hope they do, but it's going to take time and it's going to involve painful trade-off decisions that also will not be politically popular in those countries.
And the bluster already has consequences.
Right.
If you just look at the interest rate on the debt, right? If you look at the way these bonds are trading, all of a sudden, I think it was like a 6% decline in the British and German bonds just in a matter of days. And so that means it's more expensive for all these debt-laden countries to roll over their debt. Right. So that puts even more pressure on the pot.
And that's the end of the world stuff. It's bond market stuff, because that is speaking to the credit worthiness of the sovereign. Mm-hmm. And if that collapses, you have sovereign collapse. You have bad things happening.
Was that sort of how the USSR collapsed? Or was it? I mean, I'm sure it was a lot more complex.
Yeah, but I mean, Weimar. I mean, the moment that the sovereign is no longer seen as good for their debts, the currency collapses. There's regime turnover. There may be war, and so it's what's likely going to happen. We've already seen moves in this direction in like the UK, is that governments are going to start passing laws to require financial institutions, banks, and others to begin holding a certain percentage of their resources need to be denominated in sovereign bonds.
Yes.
So it's almost like a form of capital controls, but for the bond market, and that is a recipe for economic disaster. I mean, where that is government policy, rampant bank failures.
Yeah. Yeah, and you get this Potemkin economy where all the institutions are pretending to be normal, but they're actually like zombie banks, and they don't have anything behind the facade, and everybody pretends that they don't know that that's happening. Right. And then you get bank holidays, or it's like, oh, guess this week you can only withdraw 100 euros a day,
And this is a point that George Selgin makes again and again and again with regard to the so-called era of free banking in the United States, which, Keynesians love to point to, MMTers love to point to say, like, see, we need a central bank to prevent bank failures. Well, the quote-unquote free banks were, in fact, required by the government to hold a certain percentage of sovereign bonds and sovereign currencies on their balance sheets. And this, this was Civil War era, United States, or pre-Civil War era, where government credit was terrible. And so these assets failed. And because the free banks were also prevented from branching by law, so they couldn't have redundancies, they couldn't be a distributed ledger or whatever. The moment, one of their branches went under, like the whole bank went under. And so if we're serious about economic resiliency, the state genuinely has to get out of the business of private credit. And that is a multi-generational task.
Yeah, or as Bitcoiners would say, give us 10 years. What I love about the Bitcoin ecosystem is that with multi-sig and with all these technologies, that you're not geographically bound. Like, you can have a corporation that has entities around the world, and literally stores the keys around the world to unlock funds, or to give credit, or those kind of things, without needing to ask permission to one particular government. Or so I think there's a lot of potential there. But yeah, I agree. Europe is just in such a terrible situation, and also there's a lack of awareness, I think, among people of like how bad things really are. There's a lot of kind of desire to kind of keep just watching the local news, reading the local newspaper, and kind of like cross your fingers and just assume things are going to be all right. Do you think the European Union is going to last? Like, because I've heard people say, actually, the external pressures are going to kind of make it more like a unified state. But then, I don't know, like, we have the obvious example. Well, I think the longest period that Europe ever was united throughout history, aside from the Roman Empire, was like 70 years, which is the last 70 years, something like that.
Right.
So it's an anomaly for Europe to actually be united. And then now we have all this crazy debt and pressure. But yeah, what do you think? Do you think...
Yeah. I think Europe is sinking into an era of vassalage. It was already a U.S. vassal from a security and military standpoint, but it's also a vassal of Russia from an energy standpoint.
Yeah.
And it's a vassal of China from a economic production standpoint. I mean, so much of the goods, the products, the infrastructure that Europeans consume is produced by China. And so they've actually experienced cuts on all three levels of sovereignty. And they can get out of it, but it's just going to take a really long time, and it's going to involve principled leaders at the national level who are willing to break from the Brussels consensus, whether or not they choose to stay in the EU. I mean, the EU may become like the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, it might become just like a thin layer on top of everything else.
Right. You have the Habsburgs, and then you have the rest of Europe, and it's an extremely varied, differentiated continent that doesn't have a single political philosophy or economic philosophy or point of view. So it remains to be seen, but I would hope for the sake of Europe that visionary leaders emerge who have enough independence of mind to truly take their countries in their own direction.
Yeah, I was looking up what happened to Greece after the Roman Empire started to really dominate and flourish, and after Greece lost their wars. Mm-hmm. And it looks like they did pretty okay. They were kind of under the vassalage of the Roman Empire because there was a lot of fondness for Greek culture, and there were even some emperors who built things in Greece and stuff. So maybe that's kind of a best case scenario for now, where it's like, if the U.S. can get its shit together, that there can be at least some form of I don't know, protection or I don't know, like it's almost like its own Hurricane Katrina. Like, it's like Europe is just, the crime is just getting, I saw like murders in Belgium, for example, they tripled in the last 30 years. Yeah. And then what is it? Like something like 50 bombings in 2 months in Sweden. Like, there's like, I think that's also what's happening is that the state is failing, and so in that vacuum, there's just organized crime is just going rampant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else you want to?
I think we could keep talking for hours, but yeah, this may be a good stopping point for today. Yeah.
Sounds good. We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
So this book is going to come out soon, right? Can you maybe plug that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So end of March, it should be available on Amazon and on the Bitcoin Magazine Books web store. You can actually pre-order it today. It'll just be shipped out to you when it's published. And there's a really nice hardbound library edition that's coming out in May that, has like gilded pages and like a ribbon, and like it's a super nice collectible and gift. So you can order that as well.
I love that. Yeah, the Satoshi Papers is the title. I love and I've been reading in the book only digitally, but I love the way the font is laid out and stuff. I think that's also important to appreciate the form in which these things can come, and so I'm very stoked that it's a physical book and it's out there soon.
Yes.
Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah, thank you, Tor.